May 1943. The Atlantic is a graveyard. German U-boats are slaughtering Allied convoys. Then, the British deploy a top-secret weapon. It isn't a massive bomb or a new battleship. It is a crude, heavy 6-foot iron chain trailing from an airplane, and in 1 week it obliterates 4 U-boats. The air inside the briefing room at RAF Chivener smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and exhaustion. It was late May, 1943, and the Battle of the Atlantic was bleeding Britain dry. On the walls, large maps were covered in red pins, each one representing an Allied merchant ship sent to the bottom of the ocean by Admiral Karl Donitz's fearsome U-boat wolf packs. Squadron leader Richard Campbell sat in the front row, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. At 28, Campbell looked 40. He was a veteran of RAF Coastal Command, flying massive, lumbering, consolidated B-24 Liberators over the Bay of Biscay. Their mission was simple in theory, but practically impossible in execution: hunt down German U-boats as they left their heavily fortified pens in France and transit toward the open Atlantic. But the hunters had become the hunted. "They know we're coming, gentlemen," Air Commodore Jeffrey Tuttle said, pacing at the front of the room. He tapped the chalkboard with a wooden pointer. "Over the last 3 weeks, our kill rate has dropped to 0. Every time we get within 10 miles of a surfaced U-boat at night, they vanish. By the time our planes arrive, there is nothing but an empty ocean and a swirl of foam." Campbell knew exactly why. The Germans had developed a piece of counter-technology that was currently winning the war. It was a radar warning receiver called METOX. For the past year, Coastal Command had relied on the ASV Mark II radar. It was a brilliant piece of engineering that allowed British bombers to see U-boats in the pitch-black night from miles away. But the Germans had captured a crashed British bomber, analyzed the radar, and built the METOX receiver. Now, a German submariner wearing a pair of headphones could pick up the ping of an approaching British plane long before the British radar screen registered the sub. The U-boat would simply crash dive. "We are flying blind," whispered Pilot Officer David Hughes, Campbell's 20-year-old navigator, sitting to his left. "We turn on the radar, we announce our presence. We leave it off, we can't find them." "Quiet, Davy," Campbell muttered, though he agreed. The situation was desperate. If the supply ships couldn't reach England, the nation would starve, and the planned invasion of Europe would be cancelled. Tuttle cleared his throat. "However, the boffins at the Telecommunications Research Establishment have a solution. I'm handing you over to Dr. Bernard Lovell." A civilian in a rumpled tweed suit stepped up to the podium. Lovell was a brilliant physicist, but to the battle-hardened pilots of Coastal Command, he looked like a schoolteacher. Lovell adjusted his glasses and looked out at the skeptical crowd. "Gentlemen, we have developed a new radar, the ASV Mark III. It operates on a centimetric wavelength. To put it simply, the German METOX receiver cannot hear it. To them, the sky will be completely silent." A murmur of excitement rippled through the room. If the Germans couldn't hear the radar, the U-boats would stay on the surface, charging their batteries, sitting ducks for a night strike. But Lovell raised a finger. "There is a catch. A rather significant one." The room fell silent. Campbell leaned forward. "There was always a catch. Centimetric radar is incredibly powerful," Lovell explained, "but it is highly susceptible to sea clutter. The waves reflect the signal back. If you are flying at 1,000 feet, it works perfectly to find the sub. But to drop your depth charges accurately, you must descend to exactly 50 feet above the ocean surface in total darkness. As you dive, the sea clutter blinds the radar. The screen goes entirely white." Lovell paused, letting the terrifying reality sink in. "Furthermore, to illuminate the target, you must turn on your lee light, your 22 million candle power searchlight. If you turn it on too early, the U-boat will see you and shoot you out of the sky with their anti-aircraft flak. If you turn it on too late, you overshoot the target." Campbell raised his hand. "So, Doctor, you're telling us we can find them from afar, but the moment we dive in for the kill, we lose them on the screen. We can't see out the window because it's pitch black, and we have to guess the exact millisecond To trigger the searchlight while flying 50 feet above the water? Precisely, Lovell said. That's not a tactic, sir. That's a suicide pact. Which is why, Lovell said, reaching under the podium, we have built this. With a heavy, metallic clatter, Lovell threw something onto the wooden table. The pilot stared. It wasn't a sophisticated circuit board. It wasn't a revolutionary optical sight. It was a chain. A thick, heavy, crude iron chain, exactly 6 feet long, attached to a thick spool of copper wire and a brass, heavily weighted sphere at the bottom. We call it the Wild Chain, named after the engineer who finalized the circuit, Lovell said. It is absurdly simple. We will install a winch in the belly of your Liberators. Once you locate the U-boat on the new radar from high altitude, you begin your dive. At 200 feet, your radar will go blind. At that exact moment, your navigator drops this chain from the belly of the aircraft. Lovell held up the heavy brass sphere. You level out in the darkness. You fly lower and lower until this 6-foot chain hits the crest of the ocean waves. Campbell felt the blood drain from his face. You want us to drag a chain in the water while flying at 150 miles an hour in the dark? Yes, Lovell said, completely deadpan, because the moment the brass weight strikes the salt water, it completes a high-voltage electrical circuit. The salt water acts as a ground. In that microsecond, the circuit automatically fires the Lee light. It takes human error out of the equation. Lovell looked directly at Campbell. You don't guess when to turn on the light, squadron leader. The ocean does it for you. You fly blind until the chain hits the water, and instantly, night becomes day. The sub is caught perfectly in the beam, and you drop your depth charges. The briefing room erupted. Men were shouting, cursing, shaking their heads. It was madness. Flying a 4-engine heavy bomber 50 feet off the deck was dangerous enough in broad daylight. Doing it at night, relying on a dangling 6-foot chain to physically strike the ocean surface before plowing the aircraft into the waves, sounded like a cruel joke. It will work, Tuttle barked over the noise. It has to work. Squadron Leader Campbell, your crew will take the first prototype up tomorrow night. The Bay of Biscay was a black void. There was no horizon, no stars, no moon. Just an endless expanse of ink merging with the sky. Inside the cockpit of the B-24 Liberator, designated G for George, the noise was deafening. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared, vibrating through the metal floorboards directly into Campbell's boots. His hands gripped the yoke so tightly his knuckles were white. Navigator to pilot, David Hughes's voice crackled through the intercom. Target acquired. Contact bearing 040, range 8 miles. Campbell's heart hammered against his ribs. Are they moving, Davy? Stationary. Skip. They're on the surface. 2,000 feet below, cutting through the swells, was U-461, a German Type 14 supply submarine, a milch cow. On the bridge of the U-boat stood Kapitän-Leutnant Wolf-Dieter Stiebler. The night air was freezing, biting through his heavy leather coat. Radar contact? Stiebler yelled down the open hatch into the control room. Nothing, Herr Kalayan, the radio operator shouted back. The Medox is completely silent. No British emissions. Stiebler nodded, lighting a cigarette. He felt safe. The Metox had never failed them. If the British were out there, the receiver would be screaming. He allowed his men to stay on the deck, breathing the fresh air, their massive diesel engines running full throttle to charge the electric batteries. They were blind to the sky, trusting entirely in their technology. In the sky above, Campbell initiated the attack sequence. Bomb doors open, Campbell ordered. Bomb doors open, replied Sergeant Thomas Fowler, the bomb aimer lying on his stomach in the glass nose of the aircraft, staring into the pitch blackness. Davy, give me a course. Come port 10 degrees. Steady. Start your descent. Campbell pushed the heavy yoke forward. The nose of the massive Liberator dipped. The altimeter began to unwind. 1,500 feet. 1,000 feet. 800 feet. Radar screen is cluttering. Skip, Hughes called out, his voice tight. Losing the blip in the sea return. Stanby. Hold the course, Campbell said. his eyes darting between his artificial horizon and his altimeter. 500 feet. 400 feet. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. If Hughes's coordinates were wrong, they were diving toward nothing. If Campbell's hands twitched too far forward, he would drive 10 tons of aluminum and aviation fuel straight into the Atlantic Ocean. Radar is totally blind, Hughes reported. Screen is snowed out, releasing the chain now. Beneath the belly of the bomber, a trapdoor popped open. A heavy spool unwound with a sharp zip, dropping the 6-foot iron chain and its heavy brass sphere into the howling slipstream beneath the aircraft. Chain deployed, Hughes said. Circuit armed. Campbell gritted his teeth, descending to 50 feet. He pulled back gently on the throttles. The airspeed bled off to 140 knots. The altimeter needle crept dangerously close to zero. 150 feet. 100 feet. 75 feet. Jesus, Dickie, pull up, the co-pilot whispered, his hands hovering over his own controls, terrified they were about to crash. Not yet, Campbell hissed. 60 feet. 55 feet. He leveled off. They were skimming just above the lethal waves. The blackness outside the windshield was absolute. He had no visual reference. He was flying purely by instruments, trusting a crude piece of iron dangling beneath his feet. Seconds stretched into eternity. 1, 2, 3, 4. Had they missed? Had the sub dived? On the bridge of U-461, Stiebler flicked his cigarette over the railing. He turned to order the watch to change. He never got the words out. Scratch. The brass weight of the wild chain slammed violently into the crest of a massive swell. Salt water flooded over the metal. In a fraction of a millisecond, 24 volts of electricity shot up the copper wire, closing the master relay in the belly of the bomber. Instantly, the ley light mounted under the Liberator's wing ignited with the fury of a dying sun. 22 million candle power blasted through the darkness. The beam was perfectly focused, slicing through the night and slamming directly onto U-461. Stiebler threw his hands over his face, completely blinded. The illumination was so intense, so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. A-L-A-A-R-A arm, he screamed. But it was useless. From the nose of the Liberator, Sergeant Fowler didn't even have to aim. The U-boat was perfectly framed in the center of the blinding beam, just a few hundred yards ahead. Depth charges away, Fowler yelled, mashing the release button. 6 Torpex depth charges tumbled from the bomb bay in a tight, lethal sequence. Campbell yanked the yoke back with all his strength. The massive bomber groaned, its engine screaming as it pulled up violently, clearing the conning tower of the submarine by mere inches. A second later, the ocean erupted. 6 distinct, colossal pillars of water shot hundreds of feet into the air. The shock waves ripped through the steel hull of U-461, shattering the pressure vessel like a glass bottle hit by a sledgehammer. The sub lifted out of the water, its spine snapping, before plunging backward into the churning foam. In the cockpit, Campbell banked the Liberator hard to the left, circling back. The light swept over the ocean. Target destroyed. Skip. Fowler breathed over the intercom. Oil slick and debris. Good God. It worked. Campbell exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for a year. He looked at the altimeter, then down at the floorboards where the winch was quietly reeling the wet, salt-covered chain back into the aircraft. It worked. The impossible, insane, low-tech rig had outsmarted the smartest engineers in Germany. Over the next 6 days, Coastal Command unleashed the chain-equipped Liberators and Sunderlands across the Bay of Biscay. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the German Navy. On May 25th, U-752 was obliterated while running on the surface, caught completely off guard. On May 27th, U-436 was blown to pieces by a bomber they never heard coming. On May 29th, U-558 was suddenly bathed in daylight and sunk before the crew could even open the main hatch. 4 submarines. 1 week. Back in Lorient, France, Admiral Karl Donitz, stared at the decoded radio intercepts in stunned silence. His operational commander stood around his desk, terrified. 4 boats, Donitz whispered, his voice trembling with rage. 4 boats vanished, and not one of them reported a radar contact, not one warning from the Metox. Herr Admiral, his chief intelligence officer stammered. We have interrogated survivors plucked from the water by neutral Spanish fishing boats. Their reports are confusing. Confusing how? Donitz snapped. They claim there was no sound, no warning. The British aircraft simply appeared out of the total darkness, already flying at 50 feet, illuminating them flawlessly. It is scientifically impossible to calculate an intercept that perfectly without radar. And if they used radar, we would have heard it. Donitz slammed his fist on the desk. They are using something new. Infrared detectors? Spies in our ports? What is it? The intelligence officer swallowed hard. The men? The sailors in the fleet, sir. They have started a rumor, because the planes strike with absolute perfection in the dark, leaving no trace on our instruments. Spit it out. They are calling it Schwarzmagie, sir. Black magic. The men believe the British are using witchcraft. Donitz scoffed, his face red with fury. But deep down, a cold seed of dread planted itself in his stomach. The happy time of the U-boats was officially over. The hunters were blind, and the British had found a way to see in the dark. And not a single German mind could fathom that their sophisticated empire of submarine warfare was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a 6-foot piece of iron dangling on a wire. By the second week of June 1943, a suffocating blanket of dread had settled over the U-boat bases along the French coast. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, once bustling hubs of triumphant, swaggering submariners, had turned into ghost towns. The men drank heavily in the local taverns, their eyes darting to the ceiling every time a truck rumbled past outside. They were waiting for the black magic to strike them next. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Kessler stood on the concrete docks of Lorient, watching the harbor cranes load torpedoes into the belly of his boat, U-993. Kessler was a 34-year-old veteran of the North Atlantic. He had a jagged scar across his chin and eyes the color of winter ice. He did not believe in ghosts, and he certainly did not believe in witchcraft. They have a new toy, Weber, Kessler said, lighting a cigarette and passing the match to his first watch officer, Peter Weber. That is all it is. A machine. A machine that does not make a sound until it is 50 feet above your head and shining a sun in your eyes, Weber muttered, taking a long drag. Stiebler is dead. Mueller is gone. The Metox didn't give them a single ping. Kessler exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, which is why Admiral Donitz has changed our orders. If the night no longer protects us, we no longer hide in it. The German High Command had panicked, but they were not foolish. If the British planes were sneaking up on them in the dark, using some undetectable method, the solution was brutal, but logical. Stop running. Donitz ordered the U-boats to abandon their solitary, stealthy transits. Instead, they would cross the Bay of Biscay in packs of 3 or 4, heavily armed with newly installed quad 20mm flak anti-aircraft guns. They would stay on the surface, wait for the blinding light, and shoot the bombers out of the sky. It was a strategy born of desperation. The hunters were turning their submarines into floating anti-aircraft batteries. Across the English Channel at RAF Chivener, the mood was vastly different, but the exhaustion was identical. Squadron leader Richard Campbell sat in the mess hall, staring blankly at a plate of powdered eggs. Beside him, David Hughes, his young navigator, was meticulously cleaning his slide rule. The secret of the wild chain had held, and the kill counts were unprecedented. But the physical toll of flying 50 feet above the ocean, in the dead of night, was shattering their nerves. Air Commodore Tuttle entered the mess, his face grim. The room quieted down. "Listen up, gentlemen," Tuttle announced. "Intelligence indicates the Jerrys have changed their tactics. They are crossing the bay in groups. They've bolted extra flak cannons to their winter gardens. They know we need to drop to 50 feet to deploy our depth charges, and they intend to create a wall of lead at that exact altitude. Campbell rubbed his face. So, when the light turns on, we're illuminating ourselves for their gunners. Exactly, Tuttle said flatly. You are no longer sneaking up on a sleeping target, squadron leader. You will be waking up a hornet's nest. Furthermore, the weather over the bay is deteriorating. High winds, heavy swells. You all know what that means. Hughes swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his slide rule. Campbell knew exactly what it meant. The wild chain was calibrated for a relatively calm sea. It dangled exactly 6 feet below the aircraft. If the sea was flat, the plane leveled out at about 50 feet. The chain kissed the water, and the lee light ignited at the perfect altitude. But if the ocean was churning with 20-foot rogue waves, the chain would strike a crest prematurely. The light would trigger, while the bomber was still 100 or more feet in the air, miles too far from the submarine. The element of surprise would be lost, the depth charges would miss, and the Liberator would be a massive, glowing target for the German gunners. We fly tonight, Campbell said to his crew as Tuttle dismissed them. Check the winch. Double-check the wire. If that chain snaps, or if it fires early, we are dead. At 0200 hours, the Bay of Biscay was a boiling cauldron. A low-pressure system had swept in from the Atlantic, churning the ocean into a chaotic mess of foam and towering swells. Inside the cockpit of G for George, Campbell was fighting the yoke with both hands. The heavy B-24 Liberator was being violently tossed by updrafts and crosswinds. Rain lashed against the windshield like gravel. Contact, Hughes yelled over the intercom, his voice cracking. 3 distinct blips. Skip. Bearing 190. Range, 7 miles. They're grouped together. It's a flak trap, muttered the co-pilot, staring into the abyss. Bomb doors open, Campbell commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. He couldn't afford to feel fear. Fowler, arm the torpex. We take the center boat. Below them, pitching violently in the massive waves, U-993 rode the storm. Kessler stood on the bridge, completely soaked, strapped to the railing with a leather harness. Beside him, 3 gunners clung to the heavy grips of the quad 20mm cannons, their eyes scanning the black sky. To his port and starboard, 2 other U-boats carved through the water, keeping a tight formation. Maddox is clear, Weber yelled over the howling wind. Forget the Maddox, Kessler roared back. Listen for the engines. They are coming. I can feel it. In the bomber, Campbell pushed the nose down. The altimeter spun rapidly. 1,500. 1,800. Radar is cluttering with the sea state, Hughes called out. The glowing green screen was becoming a useless smear of light, bouncing off the massive waves, losing them. Lost contact. We are blind. Releasing the chain, Campbell said, hitting the toggle switch. Beneath them, the trapdoor opened. The heavy brass weight and the 6 feet of iron chain plunged into the dark, unwinding the copper spool. 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. Campbell bled the speed. He was practically stalling the massive aircraft, feeling the controls grow mushy in his hands. 150 feet. He braced himself to level out at 50, praying the sea would give him a flat run. Suddenly, a massive rogue wave, easily 30 feet high, surged violently upward from the dark ocean below. Scrash. The brass weight slammed into the top of the freak wave. The salt water completed the electrical circuit. Instantly, the lee light fired. But they were not at 50 feet. They were at 120 feet. And they were still 1.5 miles away from the submarines. The 22 million candle power beam shot through the rain, illuminating not 1, but 3 German U-boats riding the swells. Light triggered early, Hughes screamed. We're too high. On the bridge of U-993, Kessler saw the blinding beam ignite in the sky like a newly born star. But because the plane was too high and too far, the beam was scattered by the rain. It wasn't a blinding laser. It was a massive spotlight, and the Liberator was perfectly silhouetted behind it. There, Kessler bellowed. pointing frantically at the glowing bomber. Fire! Fire! 12 20mm cannons from the 3 U-boats erupted simultaneously. The night was instantly ripped apart by bright red tracer fire, streaking upward like reverse rain. Flak! Campbell yelled as the cockpit suddenly flashed with the reflection of incoming tracers. Thud! 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 Explosions rocked the right wing. Shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin. The number 4 engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and erupted into flames. Feather number 4 hit the extinguishers. Campbell roared, fighting the rudder as the plane violently yawed to the right. "We have to break off, Dickie," the co-pilot shouted, reaching for the throttles. "We're a sitting duck. If we break off, they shoot us in the belly," Campbell yelled back. "Fowler, I'm taking us down." Instead of pulling away from the wall of fire, Campbell pushed the yoke forward. It was a move of absolute insanity. He dove directly into the teeth of the German anti-aircraft fire, forcing the plane down to the lethal 50-foot mark. The tracers whipped past the cockpit glass. One round smashed through the lower plexiglass of the nose, missing Fowler by inches. The noise was deafening. The roar of the engines, the hammering of the flak, the shrieking wind. "Steady," Fowler called out, his eye glued to the bomb site, ignoring the glass raining down on his back. The center U-boat, Kessler's boat, was growing massive in the crosshairs. 50 feet, Hughes yelled. They were so low the propellers were kicking up sea spray into the burning engine. "Steady," Fowler whispered. The bow of U-993 slid into the center of the crosshairs. "Now!" Fowler mashed the button. The Liberator lurched upward as 6 depth charges fell away into the dark. "Pull up! Pull up!" Campbell hauled back on the yoke with a desperate guttural scream. The heavy bomber, missing an engine and riddled with holes, groaned in protest. It cleared the conning tower of U-993 by less than 10 feet. Kessler instinctively ducked as the massive, roaring shadow of the aircraft blotted out the sky, the heat of its burning engine washing over the freezing submariners. A split second later, the ocean detonated. Because Campbell had forced the plane down, the drop was flawless. 3 depth charges exploded directly beneath the keel of U-993. The force of the blast lifted the 800-ton submarine entirely out of the water. Steel screamed, rivets popped like gunshots, and the pressure hull cracked open. Water rushed into the engine room of the U-boat. The electrical panels exploded in showers of sparks. "Abandon ship!" Kessler screamed, realizing instantly that the boat was fatally wounded. The submarine plunged backward, slipping rapidly beneath the waves. In the sky above, Campbell wrestled the crippled Liberator into the clouds, escaping the flak of the remaining 2 U-boats. The ley light flickered and died, shattered by a stray piece of shrapnel. The cockpit was silent except for the wind howling through the bullet holes. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the air. "Status, Davy?" Campbell asked, his chest heaving. "We're leaking fuel. Skip," Hughes replied, his voice shaking. "Number 4 is dead. Hydraulics are shot. And the chain is gone. Shot clean off." Campbell looked at his hands. They were trembling violently. They had sunk the U-boat, but the Germans had figured out how to fight back. The element of pure surprise was over. The Bay of Biscay had just evolved from a hunting ground into a brutal, face-to-face slaughterhouse, and they still had a 3-hour flight back to England in a dying airplane. The freezing rain of the Bay of Biscay whipped through the shattered plexiglass of the B-24 Liberator, stinging Richard Campbell's face like needles of glass. The cockpit of G for George was a symphony of alarms and mechanical death rattles. The number 4 engine was a charred, smoking ruin, and the number 3 engine on the same starboard wing was coughing, choking on the sea spray they had ingested during their suicidal dive. "Davy, fuel!" Campbell shouted, his voice hoarse. He was putting all his physical strength into the left rudder pedal just to keep the massive bomber flying straight. David Hughes, his hands slick with hydraulic fluid that was bleeding from a severed line in the ceiling, wiped his flashlight across the gauges. "We're bleeding aviation gas from the right wing tank." "Skip!" The flak shredded the self-sealing rubber. At this burn rate, we have maybe 2 hours of fuel. We are 3 hours from Chivener. Throw everything overboard, Campbell ordered. Fowler, get to the waist, strip the guns, toss the ammo belts, the rations, the spare parachutes. If it's not bolted to the airframe, it goes into the Atlantic. In the rear of the aircraft, Sergeant Thomas Fowler and the waist gunners worked with frantic, terrified energy. The frigid wind roared through the open side hatches as they hauled the heavy 50 caliber Browning machine guns from their mounts and shoved them out into the black abyss. Heavy metal boxes of ammunition, toolkits, and even their heavy leather flying jackets followed. Every pound shed bought them a few more seconds of airtime. Down below, in the churning, unforgiving waters of the bay, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Kessler clung to a piece of cork debris. The oil from his destroyed submarine coated his skin, burning his eyes and gagging him with its toxic stench. He watched as the silhouette of U-993 slipped beneath the monstrous swells for the last time. Half his crew was gone, swallowed by the ocean or shredded by the depth charges. As Kessler bobbed in the freezing water, looking up at the sky where the crippled bomber had vanished, a cold realization washed over him. There was no witchcraft. There was no black magic. The British were just using men who were crazy enough to fly heavy bombers into the teeth of a storm, 50 feet above the waves, completely blind, relying on a crude piece of metal to light the match. It wasn't supernatural. It was industrial slaughter, driven by absolute desperation. And the Germans were losing. Back in the sky, the hours stretched into an agonizing eternity. The altimeter hovered dangerously low. Without the right outboard engine, the Liberator was constantly trying to drag itself down into a deadly spiral. Campbell's arms were cramping, the muscles in his shoulders locking up from the sheer physical exertion of holding the yoke. The co-pilot, his own hands wrapped around the dual controls, was helping him fight the machine's desire to die. Slowly, the impenetrable ink of the night sky began to bleed into a bruised charcoal gray. Dawn was breaking. Coastline, Hughes croaked over the intercom, pointing a shaking, oil-stained finger through the starboard window. Cornwall. We made it across the channel. Chivener Tower. This is Coastal Command. G for George, the radio operator broadcasted, tapping the Morse key frantically. Mayday, Mayday. Heavy damage. One engine out, right wing structurally compromised. Hydraulics are 0. Requesting emergency vector. G for George, Chivener Tower. The calm, clipped voice of a British controller crackled back through the static. Vector 030. The crash wagons are standing by. Be advised, crosswinds at the airfield are 15 knots. Copy that, Campbell muttered. Crosswinds. With a damaged wing and no hydraulic pressure, a crosswind landing was essentially a controlled crash. Drop the gear, Campbell ordered. The co-pilot pulled the heavy lever. Nothing happened. The hydraulic lines were dry. Manual crank, Campbell yelled. Fowler and the flight engineers scrambled into the narrow bomb bay, grabbed the emergency hand crank, and began turning it with frantic, burning muscles. With every rotation, the heavy metal landing gear groaning downward. Clunk. Port gear locked, Fowler shouted. Grind. Snap. Starboard gear is stuck, Fowler yelled, his voice laced with panic. The flak warped the housing. It's only down halfway. Campbell looked at the co-pilot. They shared a grim, silent understanding. A one-wheeled landing in a 20-ton bomber meant the right wing would dig into the concrete, spinning the aircraft into a violent cartwheel that would tear it to pieces. Leave it, Campbell said. Crank the port gear back up. We're going in on our belly. Brace for crash landing, Hughes shouted, abandoning his navigator's table and wedging himself against the main bulkhead. Through the cracked windshield, the green fields of Devon rushed up to meet them. The long, flat runway of RAF Chivener stretched out like a gray ribbon. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the perimeter, their red lights flashing a welcoming committee for the dead and dying. Cutting engines? Campbell said. He pulled the throttles all the way back and killed the magnetos to prevent a fuel fire. The sudden silence was terrifying, replaced only by the shriek of the wind rushing over the aluminum skin. He flared the nose of the massive bomber, holding it off the concrete for as long as possible, letting the speed bleed off. 110 knots. 100 knots. 90 knots. Hold on, Campbell roared. The belly of G for George slammed into the runway. The impact was bone-shattering. The sound of metal screeching against concrete was deafening. A massive shower of orange sparks engulfed the windows as the heavy bomber scraped down the runway at 80 miles an hour. The friction tore the bomb bay doors clean off. The fuselage buckled, the metal screaming as it ground itself into dust. The bomber swerved violently to the right, sliding off the runway and tearing through the wet, muddy grass. Mud flew over the windshield, completely blinding them. Finally, with a violently jarring halt, the Liberator dug its nose into the earth and stopped. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence inside the wreckage, save for the hiss of hot metal and the dripping of oil. "Evacuate," Campbell screamed, unbuckling his harness. "Get out! Get out!" The crew kicked open the top hatches and scrambled out onto the muddy spine of the bomber, sliding down the wings into the wet grass, just as the crash wagons roared up, spraying foam over the smoking engines. Campbell collapsed in the mud, his chest heaving. He looked back at his aircraft. The belly was completely destroyed, the radar dome was crushed, and the winch that had held the wild chain was a twisted mass of scrap metal. David Hughes walked over, limping slightly, his face smeared with soot. He looked down at Campbell and managed a weak, exhausted smile. "Target destroyed? Skip," Hughes whispered. 2 hours later, after medical checks and cups of overly sweet tea, Campbell and his crew returned to the same briefing room where the strange iron chain had first been introduced. This time, the atmosphere was not tense, but heavy with quiet disbelief. Air Commodore Tuttle stood at the front beside Dr. Lovell, his voice unusually calm. Reports from Bletchley Park had confirmed it. The U-boat they attacked, U-993, had sent a final distress signal before sinking. It was one of many. Across the Atlantic, 41 German submarines had been destroyed in a single month, an unimaginable number compared to previous losses. Even more astonishing, Admiral Dönitz had ordered a full withdrawal of U-boats from key convoy routes. The feared wolf packs had been broken. No one cheered. The magnitude of the moment settled over the room in silence. This was the turning point of the Atlantic War, what history would call Black May. It wasn't one grand invention that changed everything, but a combination of innovation and improvisation. Radar found the enemy. Depth charges destroyed them, but the crude iron chain made it possible to strike in darkness. Lovell called it temporary. Campbell disagreed. To him, it had been the difference between survival and death. Soon, better technology would replace it. The chain would be forgotten. But for a brief moment, in 1943, that simple tool helped turn the tide of war and saved countless lives. If this incredible true story of grit, genius, and a 6-foot iron chain kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten, untold histories of World War II. Share this video with your fellow history buffs to keep these legendary tales alive. What crazy wartime invention should we cover next? Let me know in the comments below.